So, very recently, I got myself a green screen that I could use in meetings and video recordings. I think that sucks. Hey, bubba, welcome to JuanMD. My name's Juan, I'm an MD, and on JuanMD I talk all about living life as a doctor and making the most of my Juan life to live. So in my last video, I talked all about the Juan conventional way that I studied for the USMLE Step 1. We all know that after USMLE Step 1 comes USMLE Step 2. I am gonna start studying pretty soon, but before I start studying, I have to plan how I'm gonna study. And you know how they say, fail to plan, plan to fail? Well, I don't plan to fail, and therefore I shall not fail to plan. In this video, I'm going to be looking at a bunch of resources that I could consider for studying for the USMLE Step 2. I'm going to make a decision on which resources I'm going to use for my own study plan. I looked at a bunch of YouTubers and considered what they used for their own study plan. These YouTubers include Manik Madaan, Malike Asaad, Tahira, Shaheera, Shah, Kevin Jubbal, the MedBros, Sarang Choi, DoktAura, Dr. Says, Kaur Beauty, Mahadotcom, Dr. Dan, DocOssareh, Ambitious Abe, and Debbie Fermin. I tabulated all the resources that they considered in their study, looked at the pros and the cons, and I'm going to come up with a resolution on what I'm going to decide to use for my study. In my last video, I used something that I call the swear table, and I'm going to be using that again in my planning in this video. Without further ado, here's my planning session on what I'm going to use for studying USMLE Step 2. So I'm using this app called Notion. Notion has this really cool view called the board view. And in the board view, you can sort like multiple pages in a bunch of columns. You can group them into color-coded columns, groups, and subgroups. And I'm gonna do just that right here. I'm looking at question banks, resources, video lectures, books, flashcards, and podcast series. And I'm going to look at their pros, their cons. Actually, in a table before that, I made a swear table. See, look, I used the strength. I took a look at the strengths, the weaknesses, the experience, action, and resolution. And, well, I added a few more R's, such as recommendations and recommended by. That's because I'm referring to YouTube videos in collating the pros and cons for these resources. So as you can see, I took a look at all these YouTubers over here. These are essentially the people who would recommend those resources. And I took a look at their comments, the pros and cons on the videos, the pros and cons of the resources, and I'm going to consider these in making my decision on whether I'm going to use these resources. That was a mouthful, but let's begin. Let's start with the OG question bank. That is UWorld. So UWorld is, well, a question bank, but it's also an information resource. And everybody seems to use UWorld. It is like the quote-unquote gold standard. But let's look at the strengths and the weaknesses of UWorld. The strengths of UWorld are that it's very comprehensive and it's very high yield. We probably all know that from our USMLE Step 1 experience. UWorld explains data very well in detail, and it has review mode and question mode options for answering blocks. In UWorld, you can track your progress relative to other people taking the same question bank, and UWorld's assessment tool, USA, tends to be very predictive. And the interface of UWorld is quite similar to that of the actual exam. The weaknesses of UWorld is that, well, it's pretty expensive, and occasionally the algorithms of UWorld are pretty inconsistent to the NBME algorithms. The QBank is not very effective if you're using it as an assessment tool. You're going to have to look at other tools in order to assess your performance. Also, you can't copy-paste explanations to your own notes. You're going to have to type it manually, which takes a bit of time. And also, you can't organize UWorld blocks by topic. You can only do it by subject or by system. As for the experiences of UWorld users, UWorld is more than enough for your own review, according to Debbie Fermin. Recommendations of people who used UWorld, Manik Madaan would say do randomized blocks on tutor mode. And then Malike Asaad would say do 2 blocks of UWorld per day. Malik and Tahira Shah would say also get the biostatistics and step 3 subscription for UWorld. Manik Madaan would say 1 pass of UWorld is enough. However, Tahira Shah would say do at least 2 passes of UWorld. Kaur Beauty would say that UWorld is considerably harder than the MBMEs. Mahadotcom would say start doing UWorld after gathering knowledge. And now, since I personally had a good experience with UWorld at this point in time, I think I have decided I am definitely going to use UWorld for my review since it's comprehensive enough, and although it's expensive, it seems to have the resources, the basic resources you need to study things comprehensively. Let's go down, going upward. Let's go to Boards and Beyond. I used Boards and Beyond in my review for step 1. And in addition to it being a question bank, it's also a video resource. The strengths of Boards and Beyond include it has speed and subtitle options for when you're watching their lecture videos. And who says it's good for? It's good for understanding pathophysiology of certain diseases. However, the weaknesses of UWorld are that it's not very extensive and it uses passive learning, means you just watch and absorb information instead of actively answering questions. And the video lectures of UWorld, from my own experience, can be very boring. For experiences of other YouTubers, I would not prioritize using Boards and Beyond. And my decision for Boards and Beyond, I'm sorry, BNB, but this time around, I'm not going to be using you. So, will not use. Let's go up to online MedEd. Now, this is pretty popular. It seems to be great competition to UWorld. In addition to being a question bank, online MedEd is a video lecture and a study resource. So, what are its strengths? It is very comprehensive. It's not very expensive compared to UWorld. It has a study schedule maker. And when watching videos, it also has speed and subtitle options. And it's very good for your basic foundations. The weaknesses of online MedEd is that it tends to be outdated because they don't update their algorithms based on the new clinical guidelines. And in addition to that, there are several errata in online MedEd. And that's something to consider if you don't want to be absorbing the wrong information into your brain while you're studying. Online MedEd also tends to be overwhelming because of the volume of information. I don't know why they didn't say that this was a weakness of UWorld, but okay, online MedEd is overwhelming. And also, since it's a video lecture resource, it utilizes passive learning. The video lectures can also be very boring. For experiences, Manik Madaan said you should only do 15% of this. Use this only if you were not confident with your USMLE Step 1 prep, according to Doctor Says. This was recommended by Tahira Shah, MedBros, Sarang Choi, DoktAura, Doctor Says, Mahadotcom, and Dr. Dan. Since online MedEd's videos are free, in addition to their question bank, you only pay for the question bank and the study schedule maker and the other resources in online MedEd, which makes it kind of appealing to me. Maybe I can use it as a reference if UWorld doesn't cut it enough for me. So my conclusion is yes, I am going to use online MedEd. I'm going to put it here and will use with reservations. And finally, the final resource I'm going to look at under question banks is AMBOSS. Amboss is a question bank as well as a study resource, kind of like UWorld. The strengths of Amboss is that it explains data very well. And it also has a high yield versus a regular mode, so an easy versus a hard mode, which is pretty good if you want to steadily increase your difficulty and take on more difficult questions gradually. It's also pretty up to date, and it's also very well structured. It's good for integrating your knowledge, and it has a free trial scholarship option if you want to try it out. The interface of Amboss is pretty similar to the exam. Like, you have an option there when you're making a question block to make it similar to your exam. It's also a good study resource for ethics and biostatistics. It's good for building stamina while you're studying, and it offers pretty good group discounts. UWorld don't offer group discounts. For the weaknesses, it self-assessment tool tends to overestimate your performance compared to that of your actual exam. Amboss is expensive. Not as expensive as UWorld, although it's still pretty expensive. It's hit or miss. Either the questions can be too tricky or too easy. It's hard to find something in between. And the questions in Amboss tend to be a bit overwhelming, especially if you're doing the 4 or the 5 hammer questions. People recommend skipping the 1 to 2 hammer questions. This is Manik Madaan. Kaur Beauty used the study resource, not so much the QBank. This is recommended by Manik Madaan, Sarang Choi, Doctor Says, Kaur Beauty, Dr. Dan, and Ambitious Abe. During my step 1 study, I had a pretty good experience with Amboss, and it really, really complemented my UWorld very well. And so, because of that, I think I will use Amboss again in studying for USMLE Step 2. Okay, we're done with the question banks. I'm sorry, BNB, it's a no for me. Online med ed, don't be too excited. I'm just gonna watch a couple of videos, but I'll think twice about buying the actual resource and question bank. For now, I'm gonna be using UWorld and Amboss for the meat of my study. Now we're done with question banks, let's go to study resources. Actually, since there is some overlap between the study resources, you can see Amboss and online med here, since they're also study resources. The Notion already placed them under will use and will use with reservations. So let's look at the other choices, Pathoma and UpToDate. Okay, let's look at Pathoma. Pathoma is a study resource as well as a video lecture database. Its strengths are that it is comprehensive and it has good visuals. However, the weaknesses, since it's a video lecture series, they tend to be boring and they're also pretty expensive. The recommendation of Malike Asaad is use Pathoma if you didn't do step 1 beforehand. I did step 1 beforehand, but since Pathoma is largely a video lecture series, I am inclined not to use it since I don't want to have to pay for that, and I already have online MedEd as a source of video lecture series. So I'm gonna put it here under will not use. I'm sorry, Pathoma. And then finally, UpToDate. It is a resource, and it's not a video lecture series. It's just a resource. Its strengths are that it's comprehensive and, well, it's up to date because it's up to date, and it's free. Well, I guess because my school has a free subscription to UpToDate. I'm not sure if your school offers that, but you might as well check if your med school does that. And if it does that, it's going to be a good resource at your fingertips, something to consider. It's expensive if your med school does not offer it as a subscription. So I am glad that my med school does that. UpToDate is recommended by Tahira, Shah. As of now, I'm like wondering, however, like, what does it have that Amboss doesn't have, since it's a study resource already, and its features are also very comprehensive, similar to UpToDate. I'm gonna use it with reservations. Why? Since I don't want to be too overwhelmed, and since Amboss itself is already pretty up to date, I guess I'm gonna stick to Ambos since it's already pretty available to me and I don't want to overwhelm myself with resources. Well, that was it for resources. Now I'm gonna go to our next section, video lectures. Well, actually, video lectures is pretty straightforward. See, there's only one under video lectures. It's Dr. High Yield. I think he was mentioned by Manik. The only strength of Dr. High Yield is that it's comprehensive. But other than that, nobody actually recommended Dr. High Yield. Um, my action for this one is I don't want to be too overwhelmed with too many resources, so I'm going to put it under will not use. Okay, that's it for video lectures. Next up, we're going to look at the books. There are quite a few resources that people recommended. Um, Essentially, there's First Aid for Step 1, Step Up to Medicine, Master the Boards, and First Aid for Step 2. Now, most people would not recommend books. Like a majority of the people I watched did not mention any books. But personally, I really want to have a book because last time when I was studying for USMLE Step 1, there was this one book called Crush the USMLE Step 1 that I found very helpful. Crush the USMLE Step 2 is pretty outdated, and so I didn't really recommend it. I didn't really include it here in my recommendations. However, I included these four, and let's go through these one by one. First Aid for Step 2 is recommended by Dr. Says. Like he didn't really mention any strengths or weaknesses. And actually, most of the people I watched say that it's not as helpful a resource as USMLE Step 1, and so I'm not going to use it. You're going here, not going to use. Next up, we have First Aid for Step 1. Type of resource? Well, it's a book, of course. The strengths are that it's comprehensive and it reviews Step 1. And since Step 1 is your foundation of knowledge for USMLE Step 2, then if you used First Aid for the Step 1, it's going to be pretty helpful if you need to recollect information. But the problems with Step 1 are that it has several errata. And my personal observation is that it uses outlines and tables, and I personally don't like outlines and tables. It's recommended by Manik Madaan, Malike Asaad, and Mahadotcom, but personally, since I don't like outlines and tables, I'm not going to use First Aid. Next up, let's look at Master the Boards. It is a book. Master the Boards is pretty straight to the point, and it's good for studying your foundations. Your weaknesses for Master the Boards are that it's filled with outlines and tables, and it's not very comprehensive, it's not very extensive with the depth it goes into studying the material. Who studied? Debbie Fermin said that she used Master the Boards for studying psychiatry, and Shah, Dr. Shah doesn't recommend this. Asaad doesn't recommend using books in general. And who's this? Who's this one? DocOssareh recommends using only one of this one and Step Up to Medicine. Let's look at Step Up to Medicine. It's also a book. Step Up to Medicine is comprehensive. It explains data well. It's good for understanding pathophysiology. It has end of chapter questions. It has end of chapter questions. And I think that's very good because it uses active learning for your studying. Actually, in the people I watched, there weren't a lot of weaknesses for Step Up to Medicine. Sad wouldn't recommend using books. Kaur Beauty would not recommend that book. I don't know why. And DocOssareh would only recommend one of these two books. Recommending Step Up to Medicine are Dr. Dan and DocOssareh. These two, out of all the books, have the most extensive review in all of the doctors that I watched. So of these two, I think I will use Step Up to Medicine. Next, we'll go to flashcards. Well, of course, well, there's pretty much just one resource that I'm aware of that is a flashcard resource, and that's Anki. The strengths are that you can use it to emphasize high yield stuff. You can use it to emphasize comprehensive facts, especially if you use like pre-made decks. Um, and it's a free resource. Its only weakness for me is that I don't like using pre-made decks. Um, it's an idea, according to Malik Madaan. I don't know what that means. Doctor says that they didn't find this very helpful. DoktAura would say make custom flashcards, and I totally agree with that. Custom flashcards, I think, are very helpful because they're more active. They're a more active way of learning if you make it yourself. Sarang Choi and Malik Madaan would say that pre-made decks are useful. I'm personally biased against pre-made decks, although I think they have their utility somewhere. But I'm inclined toward making my own deck. And Kaur Beauty would say use it for reinforcing weak topics. Anki is recommended by Manik Madaan, Sarang Choi, DoktAura, Kevin Jubbal, Kaur Beauty, and Mahadotcom. I'm going to use Anki with reservations. I have reservations against using pre-made decks, but otherwise I'm going to use it, especially during the first part of my review. Last but not the least are the podcasts. Okay, let's look at our podcast options. For our podcast, we essentially just have one. That's Divine Intervention podcast. We have quite a few strengths for this podcast, actually. Divine complements UWorld. Manik Madaan would say that this is like 10%. This covers the 10% that UWorld misses out on. The lecturer is very good, and there's a lot of choices to listen to. That's what people say. That's what people say. And it's also very well organized because the episodes are organized into all these groups. And the basic resource is free. The very basic series of Divine Intervention is free. And also, it utilizes active learning because during the podcast, there are questions that are asked that that tickle your brain to exercise active recall. Um, the weaknesses of Divine are that there are bonus courses that are pretty expensive. And at times, the volume of things that you have to listen to is pretty overwhelming. The topics are randomized. Okay, someone said that it's organized, but someone else said that it's not organized. I guess it's randomized in the sense that it's not grouped by subject and by system. Um, okay. Dr. Says would say that you would have to take down notes while studying Divine. Divine is recommended by Sarang Choi and by Dr. Says. And it's recommended by Sarang Choi that you go through this before going through UWorld. Overall, since it's a podcast, I think I'm going to use it with reservations because I have quite a bit of material already that I have decided that I'm going to use. And I guess podcast for me is just for listening to while I'm doing chores and stuff like that. There's one other podcast actually that was featured particularly in DoktAura's video, which was USMLE Secrets. She didn't really comment on that, and I have to look into it actually to check it out. And I can actually consider using it with reservations. But she was using that in her video, and she was listening to it while doing dishes, while exercising, and maybe it's something that I can consider as well in a future video. So I'm back here in my swear table, and I have applied a filter so that I'm only going to see will use and will use with reservations. And so, after much consideration, I have decided that for my step 2 review, I am going to be using UWorld, Amboss, Step Up to Medicine, Online MedEd, Up to Date, Anki, and Divine Intervention podcast. And that's pretty much it for this video. I hope my planning session was fruitful. I'm going to be open to other resources in the future. If there are any other resources that you think I should use, why don't you let me know in the comments below? That just about does it for my video on which resources I choose to study for USMLE Step 2. Thank you guys for watching. Why don't you like this video, hit the subscribe button, and click on the bell so that you can stay tuned for future updates. By the way, guys, today is actually my birthday, and I'm so glad that you are all here to watch this video and celebrate my birthday with me. Before we end, it's time for our word of the day. Until next time, guys, this has been Juan. Remember, live life to the fullest because you only have one life to live. You know, some people still call it Step 2 CK, but now that there's no Step 2 CES, you might as well just call it Step 2 because it's like the only Step 2 exam, right? So, you know, why waste the extra syllables? Just call it Step 2.